Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington here with Robert Perry, and today we are talking about what everyone is talking about, and it's the division, unrest, and outright hate that we're seeing all around us in the world, and particularly here in the United States in the wake of our presidential election last week. So many of us are looking at the electoral map and its stark divisions of red and blue, and we're wondering if we even know each other anymore. And so much of the conversations in the States this week has been some form of that, some form of questioning, who are we? And so, as we're searching for an answer to that question, as usual, the course offers a perspective that can help us make sense of the tangled web we have weaved. Robert, the material that we're going to cover today is loosely based on Chapter 26, Section 9 in the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course in Miracles. It's a section called For They Have Come. And this was one of Helen's favorites. It's one of those sections towards the end of the text where the language just gets really beautiful and lofty, but it's also a section that is extremely relevant to what we're experiencing in the world right now, isn't it?
It certainly is. Yeah. Yeah. What it brings up in light of the events of our day is a word that you mentioned that we don't like talking about, and it's the word hate.
And that's a word that appears throughout the section and
Yeah,
throughout
it
the
does.
course.
It does. Yeah. Yeah. Although I think that there is a widespread acknowledgement, outside of Course in Miracles circles, just in the country, that there is a lot of hate going on. People
Yeah,
aren't really denying that.
no, they can't
No.
anymore. Yeah, and that's one thing that you and I have been talking about in the wake of this election too, is that so much of the conversation about political division has been, well, it's economic insecurity or it's this, or they try and masking the real issue, which is that underlying hate.
Yeah, and what I've been looking at in the last several days is the obvious thing, which is there is so much of it on both sides. I think both sides feel very hated, and I think both sides are in denial of how much hate is driving them. And then to the extent it's out there, I think both sides are saying, hey, it's justified. We have good reason.
And it's almost reached a level of absurdity, hasn't it? Because you have one side that just feels like aggrieved and is hating because of that. And then you have the other side that's saying, you hate so much and you're so divisive and why are you so hateful? I hate you for being hateful. And
Right, which gets
this,
comical.
yeah, it does. And so we're seeing so much of that. And all it is these, like, I mean, I think part of the reason why we get so exhausted is it just like it looks like tomato. It's like a big tomato fight. And so there must be a better way, right?
Yeah, I think the better way starts with a willingness to look at the hate and to look at our own. And I think the unfortunate part of this is that our spiritual paths, as varied as they are, by and large don't seem to be well equipped to help us with that. It seems like whatever, spiritual bent or persuasion one is of, there's not a focus on looking at one's hate.
No, no, there isn't. There what I'm seeing is it's almost like this therapeutic overlay that has happened to the spiritual community where the ego has become somewhat synonymous with the inner child. And so you hear language like we need to coddle our ego, we need to love our ego into submission. And that's just not what the course is saying. And I know that we keep talking about this idea so much, but the course is saying that the ego is synonymous with hate. Like it's not synonymous with that inner child in you that needs to be loved. It is murderous and hateful, ancient, and it's in you. And we need to look at this.
Yeah, I don't know how much. I mean, I maybe people do say you should coddle your ego. I don't know how much they actually say it. I don't recall hearing it, but I
I
think
have
I really.
all the time. Yeah,
Oh my
it's
gosh.
the I just need to dance with my ego because it's the thing that keeps me safe.
Yeah, so I think the idea is yes, you have been traumatized, and so many of us have received horrible mistreatment, including in childhood. And you have to own that and claim it and then value yourself. And there's almost a defiant stance there that one is supposed to take, so that if one is treated or seen in ways that kind of echo the original trauma, the mental health sort of move is to respond aggressively, proudly, righteously, defiantly to those who don't accept you, who judge you.
Hmm.
And there is a hateful, you know sentiment in there.
Right. So if that is part of our spirituality, and then some thing that we've been talking about more and more recently is the idea of spirituality being the form through which we withdraw from the world versus engage with the world. And so if we're communicating a message of kind of get out there and love, and that your spiritual path is saying, well, who is there to love? Then that's a form of not looking at the hate that's in us too. So
Right.
to your point, like this spirituality should be the thing that we're bringing to call forth the highest in ourselves and be miracle workers, but our paths are ill-equipped, as you say.
Yeah, I think that in the Course in Miracles community, I feel a lot of downplaying of the other, right? There's nobody out there. There's the idea you're just my mirror. And there's so much focus on oneself that the other becomes a side issue. And then how we feel about the other becomes a side issue. How we treat the other becomes a side issue. And then the topic of hate doesn't seem that relevant. So there's
Right.
that. Another thing that I notice is that there's a huge, and we all see this is a huge emphasis on empowerment in spiritual and self-help circles, right? Every teaching, it seems like, every path, every book out there promises to empower us. Well, empowerment and hate are not the same thing by any stretch, but they sure can seem related, right? Hate can feel empowering. Empowerment can feel like, well, empowerment means I have more power than those obstacles that stand in my way, or that are arrayed against me, and I have power I need to assert in the face of them. Well, if those obstacles are people, that's not miles away from the idea of hate.
Yeah, that's where you get into angry peace workers, right? Like it
Yeah.
feels like you're the self-righteous one standing up for others who are oppressed. But in the process of doing that, if you're hating, then you're doing the very thing that you're accusing the oppressors of.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so then here
Right.
we are yet again and stuck in
Yeah.
the same old cycles that
Yeah.
our spiritual practices just aren't quite pulling us out of.
And while we're talking about this, I'm just trying to think. There's almost like a mood in the air that says this spiritual path, whatever it is meant to, in some way, make you feel better about yourself. Okay. And the message that we've got to look at our hate does not make us feel better about ourselves. It's not empowering. It's not one in which we can claim a sense of greater self-esteem. It's a downer, right? And so I feel like there's a collective avoidance of, and I'm sure, there are many places I'm sure that do help us look at our hate, but the voices I mainly hear are all skirting that issue.
Yeah, what Agreed. And what do you think the impact is if your spiritual practice is, well, there's really, if you're misinterpreting the course, for example, and saying, well, there's really nobody out there to hate. And you're using that to not look at your own hatred. What kind of impact do you think that has in the world?
Well, I think all it does, from the course's standpoint, it's in you. If you're in a body, you've got an ego. If you've got an ego, you have hate, because the ego and hate are pretty synonymous. So it's in you. So if you deny it, then it just continues. And other people feel it, even if they don't say anything, they feel the impact. They may not put words to it themselves. So it just continues. And that's what I mean, as whenever I've done classes on that feature the theme of hate heavily, and that comes up with certain sections in the text that really focus on the word. What I find, and you've seen it too, is that generally Course in Miracles students have this attitude of, I'm not really sure, I
What you
have any of
mean?
that. Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean, and I just don't feel I have any of that.
Yeah, we've done classes on this topic a few times now, and I'm always a little stunned that the same question appears, and it is, well, can you define hate? And
Right, that question does actually come up, and I was just saying to you just a little bit ago that it's kind of like when lesson 28 tells you to look at a table. No one says, can you define table? I mean, every English speaker is very familiar with the word hate. We don't need a definition.
yeah, and so we spent some time in class kind of in a roundabout on this because there were not just one question about what is hate, but there were multiple questions. And so when we were talking about ancient hate, which we're going to get into, finally you were like, it's just very old hate. like it's hate is hate. We don't really need to get
Yeah,
into the weeds on what it is. It's the desire to attack.
right. And I think that what is going on is that there is a human resistance to seeing oneself as a hater. No person wants to admit that about oneself. And we in Course in Miracles circles, we're all immersed in all kinds of spiritual teachings, right? The course, teachings on the course, and teachings outside the course. And to some degree, not not unanimously, but largely they're all collaborating on saying, hey, it's not an issue. You don't have it. It's not the thing to deal with, etc. And
Hmm.
so after all of that conditioning added on top of normal human resistance, we're just like, what?
Yeah, and there were a couple of things from not just the class we hosted on this, but previous classes that feel relevant here. And it's the ways in which we avoid looking. So, number one is trying to define what is hate, which we just talked about. Another one that I saw in the class is, well, yeah, you're right. I see that I have hate and I just can't stop attacking myself. Boy, I really need to look at that. And you
Right,
pointed out that that's obviously a way to avoid looking at the way we attack other people.
right, right. Yeah, we tend to want to, and we've been conditioned by spiritual teachings and self-help teaching. We want to make it about how we're not treating ourselves well enough with our thoughts about ourselves. Yet, hate is largely about how you feel about other people, right? We
Yeah.
know that. We know that.
Yeah. And the other one that we saw in the class was hiding in the metaphysics. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, we want to immediately go off and talk about, how the separation happened and how the world got started and all that, which is a really standard course move when you're uncomfortable with something that's basically, about you right here and right now. That's just
Hmm.
a really common classic thing. Let's go
Yeah.
kind of hang out in the metaphysics.
I love that phrase hiding in the metaphysics because that's what happens too. It was the chat in the class went off on this cul-de-sac of, well, is hate what caused the separation? And again, another way of looking, not looking rather, at what we're doing to each other every day.
Right, right. So I guess we've done a lot of table setting here. Uh, there is this issue that we all can see in our country. Um, our spiritual paths don't seem that well equipped to deal with it. In Course in Miracles circles, we, avoid it. And when it comes up, we don't know what to do with it. Uh, but the Course itself is really all about this hate. For one, the word hate and hatred is mentioned over 200 times in the Course, but it's part of a family of ideas that all go together. Obviously, it's very closely related to anger. It's very, very closely related to the ego. The Course, therefore, because the Course is targeting, our anger, targeting the ego, it's targeting our hate. And I think that if we are students of A Course in Miracles, we need to, as an act of will, kind of pull out of this, collective, collaborative denial and say, okay, I'm willing to admit this is a huge theme in the Course, and I'm willing to look at its presence in myself.
Yeah, and the Course refers to it as ancient hate in this section. And I find myself fascinated with this idea that we've carried this hate into our incarnation for very incarnations plural for a very, very long time. It is just with us. We come in with it. And so yeah, let's talk about that. What is ancient
Yeah.
hate?
Well, the Course doesn't teach reincarnation or commit itself to that. I mean, Jesus did kind of make comments to Helen and Bill, but it's not part of the system. All it's committing to is that birth was not the beginning, and the ego was not born at birth. So we've been around in some kind of egoic state for a long, long, long time, and the idea is that that hate that we carry now has obviously been with us since ancient times, however long ago that is. And what occurred to me recently, which had never really occurred to me before, is what it does to the concept of hate simply by adding the word ancient onto the front. And I looked them up, 6 references to ancient hate, hates, or hatred in the Course. There are a few in that section for they have come, but there are others scattered elsewhere as well. What I thought was, well, think about your hate. To the extent you could admit you have any, there are usually 2 things that you're telling yourself about your hate. One is that it's kind of it's in response to something immediate, right? It arose because of something that is going on now. And the second thing is that it's caused by the other person, how they are, what they have done. Usually if it's hate, they've done it repeatedly, right? So we tell ourselves it has an immediate cause and it has an external cause. But once you add the word ancient onto it, you kind of wipe away both of those. You say, this precedes anything going on now. It precedes anything that's been done to me in this life. This is just something I carry. It's in me. And if it's in me and been there since ancient times, then all this stuff in the present that I say is causing it, it's basically a convenient excuse for something that's there in me and just wants to get out.
Yeah. And this concept of ancient hate is the thing that finally unlocked that attack fear cycle. So for a long time, I had this idea in my head that we attack because we're afraid. And forever, this is like our second creations battle, like with me never quite knowing what creations are. You were always like coming back and be like, no, Emily, we attack first. And that's what makes us afraid. And I could never quite wrap my head around that until I understood what ancient hate is. If we come in and we come in with attack, like that's just part of us, somehow part of us, then attack would come first as a result. And when you get that, so much of the world, I know we said this about specialness, but so much of the world makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. It explains so much about our world because all of us are saying, well, I only did it because they did it first.
Mm-hmm.
So no one ever does it first. We're all just these kind-hearted people and we never attack first. How does that explain all the attack in the world? I think the course's explanation is much better. We just carry something in us. And yeah, it's not part of our original nature, but it's been inside us for eons. And I think the sooner we can like feel it in there and locate it in there, yeah, it's not a great feeling, but the better off we'll be because we'll be in a position to do something about it.
Yeah, and that's why we can't really consider it synonymous with the inner child, for example, because the, it doesn't appreciate what the ego really is when you do that. The ego is hate, ancient hate, and attack. And
Right.
seeing it for what it is, like looking at it within ourselves so that we can uproot it, is being clear about what lies within.
Yeah, and it's an act of taking responsibility for oneself, for one's own mind and emotions. If we're just afraid, that means somebody else did it first, right? We're reacting to them. If we're the ones that carry the attack, if we're the ones that carry the hate, then the destructiveness is in us, and then we can take responsibility for it.
So I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of a listener, and two questions are coming. One is, what would you say to somebody who is thinking, I don't connect with that because I don't feel like I have any hate, like rage and fury in me? And what would you say to a listener who does feel that they have that rage in them and is afraid of it?
Well, those are great questions, and we probably should just deal with them in order because they're obviously different problems. The first one, if you'd feel you don't have any hate in you, I think what the course wants us to do is to become very sensitive to very slight negative reactions in ourselves. There's this great line that once you read it in the workbook, you can't forget it, which is that you'll become increasingly aware that a slight twinge of annoyance is nothing but a veil drawn over intense fury. Well, intense fury is hate, right? um, so he wants us to be sensitive to the very subtle negative emotions in us and for us to realize those are kind of tamped down, versions of something much more intense that we are carrying inside ourselves. So we have to, become sensitive to and find the hate within us. There's a line in the text that says, it is so crucial that you look upon your hatred and realize its full extent. And
Mm-hmm.
and that section talks about it as the ego's darkest cornerstone, a cornerstone that's hidden, like underneath the edifice of the ego. Another thing that I think is really important in the search to get in touch with our hate is the realization that others are going to be more aware of it by and large than we are. For most people, some people are really great at hiding it and they present just the most mild, agreeable exterior. But I think for most of us, other people, especially people who've been in relationship with us long term, they feel it. They see it more than we do.
Yeah. I have to out myself on this one, and I'm doing this because I know I'm not alone in this. But one of the ways that I identify with that nice person, right? Like I don't hate. It's not something. I don't wake up in the morning with any kind of rage or anger or fury. You've even commented that it's like a vortex of harmony that I kind of have and maintain around me. But how I maintain that vortex is I I push people away. And so if I have a disagreement with somebody that's enough to, have them out of my life, I can say that I love them, and I do, but I put them in another place, like a box in my mind. I compartmentalize them in my mind. And I do that with people that I've had relationships with, and public figures that I disagree with on level. It's like I think that I'm being loving by just separating and saying I can love you while you're over there. And but that is obviously hate as the course defines it.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a great example. Another important thought is to assume out of the gate you've got it, and that if you don't see it, it's just because you aren't looking within effectively and honestly enough, and you want to look within and find it. I think we've been conditioned to have the opposite mindset. I don't want to find it, and it's not there. So we have to reverse that and say, well, if the course is right, we've all got it, and the sooner we can find it, the better. So I want to.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay,
I
so the
just feel
next,
like,
yeah,
well, just to button that up, point out, I just feel like what I'm seeing now as the tomatoes are being thrown back and forth is a lot of that kind of idea of, I wish you well, comments on Facebook group, whatnot. Like people will say, I wish you well and love you. But what they really mean is, I'm going to compartmentalize you. I'm going to put you in that box, and I will love you from way over here. And so it just, again, it's just, if you find yourself doing that, it's another form of hate.
yeah, yeah. So the other question was, what about people who see it within themselves and are afraid of it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is what leads to the first category. It's like we all see it on some level within ourselves. It scares us. And so it puts us into denial. But that's just an aside. I think the course is very aware that it scares us. There's a great lesson 93 that talks about, you think that if you could see yourself, you would, rush to death at your own hand. Um, so we are scared of the hate in us. And one of the things the course constantly tells us is, okay, it's in there, but that's not you. That's like an alien presence in you. You've let the stranger in the back door, and the hate is the stranger. So if you acknowledge that hate is in you, you should also say, yes, but that's not me. That's something alien to me. And I need to do my best to work at escorting it out of the house.
I can see where that would be comforting, where you can realize that there is this ancient hate in all of us. And so you can impersonalize it in that way. But at what point does that comfort become its own form of bypassing?
I don't think, if what you say is what I just said, I don't think that's bypassing, because if, for instance, you have, like, if you've got like a rodent problem in your house, like when I was in my teens, we had rats that got into the house and made little camps in various hiding places. And at that point, you don't say, well, the rats belong here. Um, you say, look, they're an alien presence, and you work to get them out of there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, the bypassing it's a way of bypassing the work required to get the stranger out of the house. But if you fully admit he's in the house, he's a stranger, he does not belong here, then that automatically goes along with doing the work to remove him.
Rats are a good example because as you're telling the story, I'm like, that sounds just gross. And then
It haunted my dreams for decades.
well, so the temptation is to say, well, it must be like a really dirty house, and it must be like you're making associations about the people who live in the infested house. And I say that as somebody who has also had a rat infested house when I was a kid, and rats were the least of it. We had possums too. so, so the temptation is there to say, to make a judgment again about the people who live in the house. And it feels like a better perspective is to say the rats are the alien presence. It doesn't
Right.
mean anything about the people who live there, and you just get them out.
Yeah.
And so rather than, the analogous part of this to us is this hate is an alien presence. We don't make judgments about ourselves because it's there, but we do the work to get it out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's how we need to look at this. And from the course's standpoint, this hate is the root of all human suffering. If you have anxiety, if you have grief, if you have depression, the course would trace all of that back to the attack impulse in us, which is the hate, of course. So there's a huge motivation to get it out of the house, but you can't get it out of the house till you admit it's in the house. Right.
And if you don't admit it's in the house, and again, this is where rats are a good example too, is they take over.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah, they
if
do.
same thing, like rats and our hate, if you do nothing, they infest everything.
Yeah. What happened, I won't make this long, but my mom had this 40-foot long Buick, and to fit it in the garage, she had to bump it up against the wall, and it poked a little hole in the wall that led into the house. And they started making inroads further and further and further. And it's just like the hate.
Did How long was that car?
Well, it was very long. It was the 70s, one of those big 70s boats. I was exaggerating. But in the house there were all these hidden places that you don't think about. And it's a great metaphor now that you mention it. Because the hate establishes these footholds and attaches
Hmm.
itself to all these hidden places in our minds. And then we largely deny it.
Yeah. Well, since you shared one of your stories, I'll share one of mine too. So I mentioned that we had a possum that was in the house, and my dad got it out. It was in a drawer in our kitchen. And then I was telling a friend of mine the next day about it. I was like, and you won't believe the possum that was in this drawer. And then I opened it, and I'll be damned if the possum wasn't there again. And again, I mean, I'm not trying to take this example too far, but hate is like that too. Like it just kind of like comes back to the same things, that it's comfortable hiding places, and we can get rid of it, and then we open the drawer and there it is again. And so it just feels like when we say looking at our hate, this isn't something that you can just do once and think that you've rid the house. Like you have to constantly do the maintenance work to keep it away, or
Yeah.
you'll open the drawer and there it is again.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of these two sides to it. One side is we have to be willing to look, even open the drawers. The course does talk about going in search of certain things in our minds that are of the ego, not just waiting for them to come to us. So we have to be willing to look. And then once we see, we have to take a stand and use the tools the course has given us. There's even a workbook lesson 161 that says today we take a stand against our anger.
Mm.
And so we have to, like, I've always been able to feel the aggression in me since I was a little kid. I've just always felt that desire to be negative, to be on top, to best people, to be judgmental. I used to have a friend who I felt comfortable with, and I'd say, why is it that as soon as I talk with you, I want to just basically say a lot of negative things? And it's because there were negative things in me that I wanted to say, but couldn't say in more polite company. So once you're aware of it in you, you have to take a stand and get the rats out of the house.
I love that idea of taking a stand. It is something that has gotten me through some pretty difficult times. So you have to, well, just take a stand is the right phrasing, because
Mm-hmm.
at some point you just have to say, do I want to stand up for and defend this hate, or do I want to choose love? And we're not so good at that choice. And one thing that's been very comforting to me in the course is that God lends us, like God is there for us to bridge that gap. Can you talk about that a bit?
The gap between
When
what?
we can't reach the highest perspective that we're being called to, we can lean on the Holy Spirit and on God to get us there, to reach
Yeah.
the perspectives that we can't reach alone.
Yeah, I do think that if you take the sum total of what the course says, you have to conclude that our hate, our ego is so rooted in us that left to our own devices, we wouldn't be able to uproot it. It would just be in the house permanently. So the course says that our efforts call upon the Holy Spirit to come in and help us to complete a process that we have begun, but on our own we can't finish. And then also the course says that you know this obviously the opposite of hate is love, and we are on this path to learn love, to choose love, and in our attempts to love, we can lean on God's love, which is ever present, loves everybody. Lesson 46 says, God is the love in which I forgive. And the idea is that in our attempts to forgive, we can kind of just lean on the love he always feels toward the person we're trying to forgive.
Yeah, that's what I love about that take a stand idea, is that all we have to do, and I'll speak for myself here, but what's been helpful to me is all I've had to do is be willing to side with love and ask for help and do the work, right? Like pull in the practice line. And what I find is that as I'm more willing and able to do that, I get closer and closer and closer to getting there. And it's an incremental process, at least it has been for me. It's not a light switch, but you do get there.
Yeah, I think, and in this, we have to just be willing to be happy with progress, because this is the hardest thing to uproot. You see, I mean, manifestations of hate are there even in our spiritual heroes.
Mm.
They just are so deep in human nature that we have to think, if I'm a little more loving this year, that's good.
Well, even Jesus flipped a table, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, he talks about in the course, in the CE, he talks about slips into impatience.
Mm-hmm.
And he indicates that he wasn't able to go into the usual kind of ego fits, but he had slips into impatience. One suspects with his disciples,
Hmm.
because they're consistently portrayed as kind of knuckleheads in the Gospels.
Yeah, I love that part in the dictation where he says to Helen, they didn't understand talking about the
Mm,
disciples, and so I come to
yeah.
you.
But now I talk to you and
Now
give
I
you the
talk to
same
you.
message.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the I know we got to wrap up here, but in the section for They Have Come, where it talks about ancient hate, there's a one reference to ancient miracle in there. And I know I mentioned to you that I was very glad to see it there and very inspired by it, because it's one of those things where, okay, if we're coming in with this ancient hate, to know that it stands, we're also coming in with the miracle, the desire to express love, that miracle impulse that's in us, then that feels like an important concept to look at as well, while not minimizing looking at the ancient hate.
Yeah. Yeah. The line, if I know it, is an ancient miracle has come to bless and to replace an ancient enmity that came to kill. So it's like that's always been around as well. And while you're talking about that section, we should probably just complete the picture of the section. The idea is that whenever there's a shadow that we hold between us and our brother, that's the ancient hate. But when we can genuinely forgive just that one person, and then the ancient hatred becomes replaced by a present love. And then what happens is we invite the presence of God and of Christ, our collective true self, to come down to earth, essentially, and surround us. We are standing in front of this brother we've forgiven. God and Christ come and surround us. And now that they are here, all these things come out of that. One is now we're standing on holy ground. That and this is where that famous line comes from. The holiest of all the spots on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love. So we're standing on holy ground. We are standing in a kind of a temple because the presence of God and Christ are here. And the earth, which had been scorched and rendered desolate and bloodied by our hate, is healed, and grass and flowers spring up. We become surrounded by a living temple, almost like you can imagine foliage, creating a temple structure. And so the earth itself is cleansed and healed. And so the idea is, yes, the ancient hate is there, but just one moment of forgiveness with one other person overturns everything hate has done, all the destruction it has wrought, and invites us to be in a kind of heaven on earth, where we're standing on holy ground in a healed environment, and the presence of God and Christ are with us as if we're in a temple.
That sounds like exactly what we need right now, doesn't it?
It is what we need. You almost can, those two people, you can almost, see them as blue and red.
Mm. What a just remarkable and could only be of God idea that for they have come is the idea that God and Christ come through us, in us, to heal the world. And
As we let go of the hate.
as we let go of the hate and repair interpersonally.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that has always moved me about the course. It's the primary reason why the course is my path, is that it's really focused on getting us to heal our relationships with other people. And the plan for salvation is that as we heal with others, and the world becomes a better place, and we go home to God.
And that's how the course was born. I mean,
Mm.
you can almost, the two people initially were Helen and Bill. You can almost see him as referring back to their better way conversation in which the course was born. That was kind of like one of those moments where, there was forgiveness, they joined, and, they stood on holy ground.
That feels like a great place to end, although I know we will be talking about this idea and this concept more and more,
We
because
will.
it's needed more and more.
It is so needed.
Yeah. Robert, thank you. And see you next time.
Okay.